I've been on a bit of a Robotron kick lately. A couple of months ago, I picked up Robotron X on the PS1, Robotron 64, and even recently discovered Centipede Infestation on the Wii, which, despite having the name Centipede, is a blatant throwback to Robotron in its gameplay style. Robotron 64 is a semi-port of the PS1's Robotron X to the N64. By semi-port, I mean it uses some of the same level themes and even some of the gameplay stylings of the PS1 version, but puts them in a game that feels almost completely different at times. For those unfamiliar with the Robotron series, the original Robotron 2084 hit arcades in 1982, and was a twin-stick shooter using one stick to move your character and the other to handle directional firing, and is an extremely challenging yet extremely addictive classic arcade game. It's one of the kinds of games that no matter how abysmally you play, nor how quickly you die, you always find yourself coming back for more. Without a doubt, a classic. Robotron 64 carries on those same addictive traits first seen in the original arcade game, then brought into the 3D era of gaming with Robotron X on the PS1, and then sort of ported to the N64 from the PS1 version, even if they are two completely different yet similar games. It never matters which version of Robotron you play because all of them are fantastic and incredibly addictive. According to the official GameSpot review of this game, the N64 version almost didn't get released. In their paltry review of Robotron 64, they said, and I quote, "In December of 19..." Sorry, that's actually my mainstream media quotation voice right there. I honestly have to say it like this, sorry. "In December of 1996, Robotron X was released on the PlayStation. This polygonal take on the Robotron series was decent, but was also incredibly easy and, yes, even tedious." I completely disagree with this, by the way. Robotron X on the PS1 is hardly easy unless you play it on easy, and though, yes, it may seem tedious at first, is still completely addictive and keeps you hooked. The quote continues, "Midway promised that the N64 version would follow soon after, but weeks turned into months and eventually Midway dropped the project. Crave Entertainment picked up the project, dusted it off, and released it over a year later." Though the same developers who created X on the PS1 also developed Robotron 64, Player One Studios, I believe is what they were called, it has a completely different feel from the PS1 version, yet still that same classic feel of Robotron at the same time. When I did my review of X, some comments complained that Robotron 64 was too easy, and it does feel pretty easy at first, but does gain in hardness as time goes on, and the gameplay is just as engaging and addictive as other versions. I was able to beat this game on normal difficulty setting with some difficulty. It still has a good challenge to it, especially if you up the difficulty setting. The basic concept of Robotron 64 is the same as all other versions. Players wander these small arenas killing hordes of enemies trying to kill them, while trying to save Mom, Dad, Little Mikey, and Grandpa, the last remaining human family on Earth, from destruction. The enemies have a good variety to them, from the invincible Hulks who cannot be destroyed yet hunt down members of that last human family, the giant brains, and even the large boss battle at the last level. The frenzied gameplay of Robotron 64 tests your quick reflexes, dodge ability, and on-the-fly strategy in trying to save members of that family. Eugene, the main character, dies in one hit, making things all the more intense, and the gameplay gives you an overwhelming sense of excitement. As I said in my previous review of Robotron X, with the simple concept of Robotron 64, kill everything, save the humans, and kill everything, and these simple controls, the real question isn't how do you play Robotron 64? The real question is how do you stop playing Robotron 64. Robotron 64 has the same addictive qualities of a game like Gauntlet. where it's very hard to put your finger on it that, despite its repetitive nature, the game still draws you in for just one more level. And then after that you say, how about one more level? And then, okay, this one will be the last one, I promise. Putting this game down is really hard to do once you pick it up, which is the sign of a true classic. The N64 version has two control setups that work really well for this game in order to mimic the twin-stick controls of the arcade original. The first sees players moving with the analog stick and handling directional shooting with the C buttons. The second option allows players to dual-wield N64 controllers, using the analog stick on the first for movement and the second for directional shooting. This takes a little bit of getting used to at first, but is no more difficult to get the hang of than the nunchuck was for the Wii. I generally found myself using the C buttons as I have very little experience with the actual arcade original and more experience with games like Smash TV on the Super NES, but I also found the dual-wield analog play to be just as functional in the game as well. The controls are responsive and I have no complaints to wage there whatsoever. Graphically, the small arenas allow for a ton of action on screen with a completely solid frame rate, but the enemy models support less textural detail than the PS1 version did. The N64 version also seems to run a little bit slower than all other versions of the game, even on the highest speed setting, making dodging a little harder in this one. But the game still manages the same intensity of Robotron X at times. The game offers multiple camera angles, but all of them outside of the arena angle are unplayable, as even the classic top-down angle is zoomed in too far to be playable. The techno beats in the game fit the action well, and are another highlight of the game. I really enjoyed them, and the sound effects fit the retro vibe of the game very nicely. If I have one complaint against Robotron 64, it's the same one I levied against Robotron X in my review of that game. And that is, though there is a two-player multiplayer option in the game, it isn't two-player simultaneous play. Instead, both players take turns playing like old-school Mario. While I can't fault the game for what it doesn't have, a 2 to 4 player option for the N64 version of this game would have really rocked. That being said, with the dual controller option in the game, you could technically modify it into a 4-player game in the 2-player mode, with teams of 2 taking turns, one player controlling the movement and the other shooting with the second controller. Better than nothing, I guess, but 4-player simultaneous play in Robotron 64 would have been epic! The bottom line! With its simple concept but classic, addictive, and frenzied gameplay, I see Robotron 64 as a must-buy for N64 owners. This game never really gets old despite its repetitive nature. There's just something in the gameplay that will keep you playing for all 200 levels of the game and returning again even after you have completed it. This is more than just a simple retro reboot, it's also one of the best N64 games out there.